picture a 13-year-old boy,
Yeah.
right, in 1865. He's standing on the deck of this colossal wooden warship in the Mediterranean, just completely enveloped by the absolute peak of British imperial power.
Yeah, surrounded by the greatest navy on earth.
Exactly. Now, fast forward 15 years, and that same guy is shivering under the stars in this barren, waterless expanse of the Australian outback. He's a bankrupt cattle drover who has literally lost everything.
It is the ultimate historical pivot.
It really is. And somehow, that totally devastating failure in the desert becomes the exact catalyst for him to battle the British Admiralty, build an entirely new fleet from scratch, and become the father of the Royal Australian Navy.
It's an incredible trajectory.
Yeah.
And for our deep dive today, we're pulling from this really fascinating stack of sources. We've got biographies, military obituaries, cemetery records, historical society notes, all to trace the life of Vice Admiral Sir William Rooke Creswell.
Which is, well, it's quite a life.
Right, because to understand how a guy actually engineers the maritime defense of an entire continent, you have to look at the extreme contradictions he lived through. I mean, he wasn't just some theorist sitting in a war room.
No, not at all. So I want to ask you, the listener, have you ever made a complete pivot in your career only to discover that the very things that blank you in your past gave you the exact, strategic blueprint to build something entirely new?
Because that is the absolute core of Creswell's story.
Exactly. So let's unpack this. He's born in 1852 in Gibraltar, which means he basically grew up with the Mediterranean fleet in his backyard.
Yeah, his dad was the colony's deputy postmaster general.
Yeah.
And the sources note that young Creswell was just mesmerized by these massive ships of the line, the oaken bulwarks, as they call them.
Oaken bulwarks, right. And by age 13, he's a cadet on the training ship HMS Britannia. So he is fully absorbed into the bloodstream of the 19th century Royal Navy.
And being absorbed at 13 means your entire worldview is constructed around Pax Britannica. I mean, he was trained to view the oceans not as barriers, but as British highways.
It's like working for a massive global corporate monopoly. You're this tiny disciplined cog in a worldwide machine.
That's a great analogy. And by 1869, he's serving as a midshipman on this huge world training cruise aboard the frigate HMS Phoebe.
Which is part of the flying squadron, right?
Yes, the flying squadron. Essentially this traveling armada designed to just project British power globally, show the flag in these far-flung ports, and train thousands of sailors at the same time.
And this was his very first physical exposure to Australia.
Exactly. But he's not just seeing the sheer scale of the empire. He's also seeing the very sharp end of how it was enforced.
Because the Royal Navy wasn't just sailing around looking intimidating. They were actively managing these highly violent global trade routes.
Right. Fast forward to 1873, and Creswell is stationed on a gunboat, the HMS Midge, over on the China station.
And their main job wasn't fighting other navies. It was actually protecting British merchant shipping from these really organized, deeply entrenched pirate syndicates.
Yeah, operating along the coasts and the rivers. And the tactical reality there was grueling. These pirates used shallow draft vessels in complex river deltas.
So those massive British ships of the line were completely useless.
Totally useless. The Navy had to rely on these small, heavily armed gunboats like the Midge to navigate muddy, really treacherous waters, like the Larute River off the Malay coast.
Which led to some incredibly volatile close-quarters engagements. In fact, during one really violent skirmish on the Larute, his unit is ambushed, and Creswell takes a pirate's bullet directly to the hip.
Which, would incapacitate almost anyone.
Oh, absolutely. But the naval dispatches show he just outright refused to be evacuated. He stayed at his post, bleeding, commanding his men through the entire firefight.
And that actually earns him a special accelerated promotion to lieutenant for gallantry.
Which is wild. But how does a guy who literally bleeds for the British Empire fighting pirates eventually end up fighting that same empire to build a separate Australian Navy?
What's fascinating here is that this moment plants a strategic seed. Fighting in those muddy river deltas, totally isolated from the main fleet, taught him a hard lesson about power projection.
Because the Royal Navy ruled the deep ocean,
But on the fringes of the empire, local geography dictated your survival. He was seeing firsthand how vulnerable a distant outpost really was if it had to wait months for a battleship to show up from London.
Wow, right. And that friction between imperial theory and local reality just intensifies in his next major deployment. So in 1877, he gets posted to the HMS London.
Right, which was serving as a depot ship in Zanzibar East Africa.
Yeah.
And the mission objective shifts from suppressing pirates in Asia to suppressing the Indian Ocean slave trade.
And this is where we really see his operational brilliance come out.
Oh, definitely. The human traffickers there used these slave dhows fast, shallow draft sailing vessels that could just easily slip past large British cruisers into coastal inlets.
So conventional naval tactics were failing again.
Exactly. So Creswell realizes he needs localized intelligence to dismantle these networks. And what does he do? He painstakingly learns to speak Swahili.
Which shows incredible adaptability.
It does. Then he takes command of a flotilla of small boats, operating independently for weeks at a time, intercepting these dhows at close range. His success rate was so phenomenal that he actually received the official formal thanks of the British Foreign Minister, Lord Salisbury.
Okay, wait, I need to stop you there. Because he's a decorated combat veteran, he has the official backing of the foreign minister, he's proving himself as this elite tactical commander. And yet the sources show that just a year later, in 1878, he abruptly resigns his commission.
Yeah, walks away.
Why would a rising star throw away his entire career trajectory like that? It just doesn't track.
It really comes down to the grim reality of 19th century military bureaucracy and biology, honestly. The environment in Zanzibar was brutal.
Right, the diseases.
Exactly. Creswell contracted severe tropical fever. He suffered these repeated relapses that just physically broke him. He was eventually invalided out of active duty.
Oh, wow.
And compounding all of this, the Royal Navy was actually shrinking in size at the time, which created a massive bottleneck for promotions.
So even with his accolades, he was looking at years of stagnation on half pay.
Yep. And then, on top of the illness and the career stall, his father dies, leaving the family practically penniless.
So he's physically ruined, he's financially destitute, and he's basically locked out of the only institution he has ever known.
The empire he bled for just had no use for him anymore.
Which forces the massive pivot we mentioned earlier. Here's where it gets really interesting. In 1879, he migrates to Australia, intending to reinvent himself as a wealthy pastoralist.
Right. He sets his sights on the harsh Northern Territory and Queensland, which is an environment almost incomprehensible to a man raised on the ocean.
It's like an astronaut deciding to suddenly become a baker and just failing terribly.
Exactly. He spends years droving cattle, exploring this trackless wilderness, trying to carve out a living in the dust.
There's even a huge cattle station today near what's known as Creswell Downs, named after him. But the contrast is staggering. You've got a guy trained from childhood to navigate a frictionless ocean using the stars.
Suddenly trying to force herds of cattle through an abrasive, waterless desert where the horizon offers no safe harbor at all.
And despite the records noting his fine physique and his intense determination, the outback just completely defeats him.
It was a catastrophic financial failure. He spends years sleeping in the dirt, working himself to exhaustion, and ends up totally bankrupt.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, that failure was actually crucial, right?
Absolutely. Think about an officer in an Admiralty office in London. They look at a map of Australia and just see a neatly outlined British possession.
A shape on a piece of paper.
Right. But sweating and starving in the outback, Creswell physically felt the terrifying vastness of the continent. He experienced its extreme isolation from the rest of the world.
That visceral understanding of Australia's geographic vulnerability.
Exactly. That became the bedrock of his future naval strategy. He knew that abstract imperial defense theories drawn up in Whitehall wouldn't save this massive island if a real threat emerged.
Because the outback basically spit him out, forcing him back to the only frontier he actually understood, the sea.
Yeah, the sea was calling him back.
So in 1885, he's broke, he's visiting Adelaide, and he has this serendipitous meeting with an old shipmate from his China station days, Commander John Walcott.
And Walcott throws him a lifeline. He offers Creswell the position of first lieutenant on South Australia's solitary warship, the cruiser HMCS Protector.
So what does this all mean? Taking that post on the Protector merges his elite imperial naval training with his new, hard-won understanding of Australian isolation.
And almost immediately, he starts challenging the prevailing political orthodoxy. By 1886, Creswell is writing extensively in the press, systematically dismantling the colony's reliance on the British subsidy model.
Right. Let's break down that subsidy model because it's really the core of the political war he waged. The Australian colonies were essentially paying a direct financial tribute to London just to maintain a squadron of British Royal Navy ships in Sydney.
It was basically outsourcing their sovereignty.
Yeah. It's like renting a house. You pay a fortune every month, but you build absolutely no equity, and the landlord can just kick you out whenever they want. Creswell wanted Australia to own its defense.
This raises an important question, though. How do you convince colonial politicians to spend massive amounts of money building their own ships when the world's most powerful navy is offering them a subscription service?
Especially since politicians loved the subsidy because it seemed so much cheaper than building shipyards and training local crews.
But Creswell pointed out the fatal flaw. It was taxation without strategic representation. Australia paid for the ships, but the British Admiralty retained total operational control.
So if a conflict broke out in Europe, London could legally just order the Sydney Squadron to sail away, leaving Australia completely defenseless.
Exactly. He argued that a nation cannot claim to be secure if it doesn't own the very instruments of its defense.
And he wasn't just writing op-eds either. He actually puts down deep, permanent roots. He marries Adelaide Elizabeth Stowe, and he methodically politics his way up the chain of command.
Right. He eventually becomes the naval commandant of South Australia. He's building alliances, writing these exhaustive strategic white papers, just waiting for the moment to prove his theories.
And that moment arrives in 1900 with the Boxer Rebellion in China.
Yes. Creswell takes command of his old ship, the HMCS Protector, and deploys to the conflict zone.
Which the sources point out is a monumental milestone. It's the very first time a colonial warship is deployed on active imperial service.
And the performance of the Australian crew just shatters London's assumptions.
Because the Admiralty had long viewed colonial sailors as second-rate, right? Like
Yep.
weekend militia unfit for real warfare.
Oh, totally. But Creswell integrated the Protector seamlessly into the imperial tactical formations. They executed complex maneuvers, maintained flawless discipline, and basically forced the Royal Navy commanders to officially recognize their capability.
And he absolutely weaponized that success. When the Australian colonies federated into a single Commonwealth nation in 1901, Creswell's credibility was untouchable.
He was appointed the director of the Commonwealth Naval Forces.
Which gives him a national platform. And in 1906, he travels to London to pitch his master plan directly to the British Admiralty.
A sovereign Australian fleet of torpedo boats and destroyers dedicated solely to coastal defense.
And they practically laugh him out of the room.
The rejection was brutal. They utterly rejected the proposal, stating it had, quote, no strategical justification.
They treated him as persona non grata. They were whispering that he was just a colonial upstart trying to build a personal fiefdom to stroke his own ego.
Which had to sting, coming from the very institution that raised him. But their hostility was rooted in their commitment to the blue water strategy. They believed global sea control required concentrating all your heaviest battleships into one massive force to destroy the enemy's main fleet.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Wasn't the British Admiralty right from a global perspective? Like, why fragment the fleet? It's like breaking up a Major League Baseball team into local neighborhood squads. Didn't Britain need all its ships concentrated?
You're right, mathematically it makes sense. If you think of global defense like a central banking system, the Admiralty is acting as the central bank. They need to hoard all the battleships in one central vault to prevent a systemic collapse.
Right.
But Creswell is acting like a local branch manager demanding his own armed guards, because he knows that the central bank won't care if his specific neighborhood branch gets robbed.
Ah, that geopolitical tension. Because if the Admiralty destroys the enemy's main fleet in the North Sea, they figure the Australian coast is naturally safe.
Exactly. But Creswell, informed by his time in the outback and fighting regional pirates, saw the glaring blind spot. A localized raider or a rogue cruiser squadron, they could devastate Australian shipping and bombard coastal cities long before a British battleship could sail all the way from Europe.
He realized the Empire's priorities and Australia's survival were officially diverging.
Yeah, as Britain focused inward on rising European threats, they couldn't protect everyone everywhere anymore.
And his persistence makes him deeply unpopular in London, but history ends up vindicating him with terrifying speed.
By 1909, the rapid, aggressive expansion of the Imperial German Navy completely shatters the Admiralty's confidence.
They realize they simply don't have enough ships to maintain dominance in the North Sea and protect the Pacific at the same time.
So they're forced to concede to Creswell's logic. They agree to the creation of an Australian fleet unit.
And the pace of the buildup from there is just breathtaking. In 1911, King George V officially grants the title Royal Australian Navy. Creswell is promoted to Rear Admiral and knighted.
But he doesn't just buy ships, He builds the institutional foundation. He helps establish the Royal Australian Naval College at Jervis Bay.
Right, to ensure a permanent pipeline of homegrown officers, cutting that reliance on British commanders.
And in 1913, the realization of his life's work steams into Sydney Harbor. A modern fleet led by the massive battlecruiser HMAS Australia and the light cruisers Sydney and Melbourne.
Which meant that when the First World War erupts just a year later, in 1914, Creswell's local branch vault is fully armed.
The mere presence of HMAS Australia deterred the formidable German East Asia Squadron from operating near the continent.
And in this stunning validation of his vision, the HMAS Sydney actually hunts down and destroys the notorious German raider Emden in the Indian Ocean.
Creswell's stubborn foresight practically saved the Australian coastline in those opening months. And he managed this massive, unprecedented administration of a global naval effort right from his desk in Melbourne.
And we have to slow down here because the sources reveal a profoundly heavy cost to this victory.
They really do.
We see a man who spent 3 decades fighting the bureaucracy of an empire to build a shield to protect Australian sons, only to have his own family fed into the industrial meat grinder of the First World War.
Yeah. The administrative triumphs he achieved in his office were constantly punctuated by these devastating telegrams arriving at his home.
It's a tragic irony.
His son Randolph, who was serving with the Imperial Camel Corps, was killed in action in Palestine. His son Colin, who had actually followed his father into the Royal Navy, was lost when his submarine sank off the Dutch coast.
Oh, man.
And a third son, Edmund, survived but was severely wounded at the brutal Battle of Bullecourt. And this immense grief just compounded the loss of his daughter Margaret, who had tragically taken her own life just before the war began.
It is an almost unfathomable burden to be the architect of national defense, responsible for the safety of a continent, while systematically losing your own children to the broader machinery of the war.
Yet the final notes in the historical archives highlight a resilience that borders on the superhuman. His strategic clarity never wavered, even through the darkest periods of his grief.
Because as the First World War concluded, while politicians in London and Melbourne were eager to just slash military budgets and declare an era of permanent peace,
Creswell was already analyzing the next horizon. Before he retired in 1919, he was actively warning the government about the shifting balance of power in the Pacific.
He specifically identified the rising strategic threat of an expansionist Japan, didn't he?
Yes. He was anticipating the crises in 1941, while the rest of the world was still recovering from 1918.
He finally steps away from the military, retiring to a farm, which is, a poetic return to the land, but this time on his own terms. He passes away in 1933, universally recognized as the father of an independent maritime power.
A man who transformed a collection of dependent colonies into a sovereign force capable of projecting power across its own oceans. He fundamentally altered the geopolitical reality of the Southern Hemisphere.
Because he proved that true security requires not just alliances, but the autonomous capacity to defend your own shores.
Exactly.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Vice Admiral Sir William Rooke Creswell, I want to leave you with one final thought to consider. Our sources note the accolades that flooded his later years. The knighthoods, the military honors, even the Order of the Rising Sun from Japan in 1920.
But none of those honors exist without his most spectacular failure.
Precisely. Consider this. If Creswell had actually succeeded as a cattle farmer in the 1880s, he would have just remained a wealthy, obscure pastoralist in the Northern Territory. He never would have returned to Adelaide broken and bankrupt.
He never would have run into his old shipmate, stepped onto the deck of the Protector, or started writing those op-eds.
And without the absolute misery of his failure in the outback, Australia might not have had a fleet ready to meet the German threat in 1914. So look at the landscape of your own life. What perceived devastating failure in your past might actually be the necessary geographic detours, steering you away from a life of quiet success and forcing you toward your true historical legacy.